Hello and welcome to today's Forrester webinar, Best Practices, Pandemic Planning and Preparedness. At Forrester's request, this call is being recorded. The content of this webinar is copyrighted material of Forrester. Rebroadcast, retransmission, or unauthorized duplication is prohibited. Attendees are currently in a listen-only mode and will have the opportunity to participate in a Q&A session after the formal presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please send a message to the meeting host via WebEx chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce your speakers, Stephanie Baloras and Ala Valente.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and thank you, Ala, for joining me today. This is Stephanie Baloras, and thank you all for joining. This is important timing. Actually, we just got word a little while ago that the World Health Organization officially has classified COVID-19 as a global pandemic. I think everyone has been referring to it as a pandemic for the last few months, but it is official now. It is officially a pandemic. So, in this webinar today, we're going to offer a mix of advice and best practices. So for those of you who have yet to actually build a pandemic plan, there's going to be a lot of specifics on building a plan from scratch. For those of you who have already built one, or perhaps you're actually dusting off a plan that maybe your organization created 10 years ago for swine flu, there'll be enough advanced best practices in here for that to be valuable. And as the operator mentioned, we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. And also, please ask questions through the chat throughout the presentation so we can take as many questions as we can. So to kick things off, one of the things I did want to reiterate is you do need a pandemic-specific plan. The vast majority of companies do have business continuity plans in place. But in my experience, most companies and organizations, maybe your healthcare, maybe your government, have what I call impact-based scenarios, impact-based plans, which is they have general plans that account for things like loss of facilities, loss of employees, loss of IT services. Those are beneficial because you can't always plan for every type of business disruption or outage, whether it's extreme weather or an IT failure, a flood, human error. There's so many different scenarios to attempt to predict that it doesn't make sense to have a specific plan for each one of them. But there are scenarios where you really do need a specific plan, and a pandemic is one of them. There are other scenarios like a ransomware scenario. There are just certain risks and threats to the business because of their nature require a very specific response, and those generic plans aren't good enough. And one of the reasons why you do need a pandemic-specific one is compared to most events that befall your organization, some of the ones I mentioned, extreme weather event, IT failure, a pandemic has a long duration and it has a changing risk profile throughout its duration. So, in the case of this pandemic, China has already reached peak number of infections. So they're actually on the decline, hopefully. Whereas for much of Western Europe and the United States, we're just starting to see infections rise. So we might be looking at another 3-4 months of dealing with this pandemic. So that's a long duration. And throughout that 3 or 4 months, we're going to see rising rates of infections. For organizations, that means different rates of employee absenteeism, potentially. Sometimes pandemics will actually surge, taper off, and then surge again, particularly as you go through different seasons of the year. So again, long duration, changing risk profile. I alluded to this. Throughout that changing risk profile, you're going to have different rates of employee absenteeism, different requirements for employee quarantine at home, some of it government mandated, some of it recommended. You're going to have potential supply chain shortages and disruptions, as well as third-party service disruptions. Remember, all of your supply chain partners, all of your third parties, they're going through this with you. So they're going to be facing the same types of employee absenteeism. They're going to be facing their own supplier disruptions for certain parts and goods and what have you. So they're in the same boat that you are in. And again, this is happening over a long period of time. Your ability to deliver the same level of service to your customer that you're used to delivering is going to change throughout this. And as I also kind of alluded to, there's going to be government mandated closures of everything we're already seeing, like events, schools. Some right now in Europe and the United States, there's particular mandates that vary by region where you have to cancel events of a certain size. You might have travel restrictions eventually and other types of bans and border checks. So it is a completely different event than what we're used to seeing. And also, our plans just don't account for it. The other thing I'll add too is, well, epidemics and disease outbreaks, we have dealt with things like SARS and Ebola, but this is the first global pandemic since swine flu, which has been about 10 years. And prior to swine flu, it was about 40 years since the last global pandemic. So we have some experience with localized disease outbreaks and even regional epidemics, but not a lot of experience with true global pandemics. So what we're going to do through the presentation is actually talk about the key steps, and then for each one of those steps, we're going to offer key lessons and advanced lessons. So hopefully there's benefit for those who already have plans in place, as well as those who are starting from scratch. So this one seems obvious: build the response team. This would include your core business continuity response team, but then you want to add additional individuals. And this is where, again, you might see a difference between your general business continuity, crisis management, and response team versus the pandemic plan and response team. For pandemic, HR is going to play an outsized role. In fact, you probably want HR to lead in this scenario. So much of what we're going to talk about actually will not have a lot to do with technology. Technology is going to play an important role, but so much of this is actually going to be HR decisions and actually decisions by business leads. So when it comes to HR, it's going to be a lot to do with things like employee leave and work from home policies, recommendations about when employees have to self-quarantine, as an example, dealing with questions about sick and paid time off. When it comes to business leads, a lot of the decisions we're going to have to make are around whether we can rotate workloads to other regions if we happen to be a large company with a multinational presence. It's going to be incumbent on business leads who really know their areas to figure out potential like workarounds, or if there's other contingencies that you can put in place for employee absenteeism. Maybe you can cross-train employees, maybe you can't, maybe we have to hire contract workers. Those are not IT related decisions, and they make up the bulk of what we have to consider during pandemic planning. And the CIO will play a role, but in this case, technology becomes more of an enabler. It's an enabler for reliable crisis communication at scale. And of course, there is going to be a portion of your strategy that is going to be dependent on employees' ability to work from home. And that's where the CIO is going to play a huge role in ensuring that they have access to all their needs for telecommunication and collaboration, critical applications and data, et cetera. Sales and customer service, again, depending on how long this pandemic goes on and different rates of absenteeism, we're going to have to adjust customers' expectations of the types of services that we can deliver to them. And that'll be a sales and customer service led kind of discussion, as well as a determination of what's possible and what's not. And then finally is the CMO. I think the CMO, we don't always historically think of as being really core to the business continuity team. Again, in the pandemic, I think he or she plays a very important role. Companies have to be very careful about what they say publicly and the specific messages that they deliver to customers. Customers absolutely want to know what you're doing to be ready for the pandemic. They want to know what steps you're taking. They want to know what steps you're taking to protect them, as well as to continue business with them and offer services. But there's a fine line between delivering that essential communication and demonstrating empathy for customers and being seen as being opportunistic and taking advantage of the situation. So the CMO really has to be involved here from the beginning at an executive level as a core part of the response team.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Stephanie, that, while HR takes the lead, the CMO is really valuable because they're the ones that own the messaging, the communication, and the PR teams, and therefore those strategies. And so, they have that responsibility for setting the tone of the communication, understanding whether or not the message they're putting out aligns with corporate values and the response plan itself. And they can really start mobilizing the internal communications to the employees and to business partners, external communications out to the media, and really take advantage of their public relations contacts and folks to be able to put out a broader message about the company's position and what steps they're taking in this process.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And actually, this example that I have on the screen here, it's MIT here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And while it's a higher education example, the reason why I like this example that I know you found, Ala, is that it's a good demonstration of the kind of multidisciplinary team and cross-functional team that you really have to bring together to pull this off.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a great example of how, okay, so you have this response team, and those are all of the really senior key players that you need to be able to respond as a company. But you also need, those boots on the ground, so to speak. And so to be able to mobilize, to coordinate these smaller working groups that are mobilizing and taking action around specific areas, for this pandemic are really critical. So, here in this example, you're seeing how these different areas of student life are coming together. So it's the academic coordinating with, the research, the medical, residential life, and being able to align on that common message so that, the community, in this case, MIT community, knows what their plans are, what they should be doing, and, what they're expected to do going forward. So this type of cohesive, coordinated message is going to be critical, both for making sure that you don't have fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but also about getting everyone on board with, this is what we're doing now, this is what's coming next, this is what's expected of you, and that communications plan is absolutely critical in this case.
Yeah. So one of our first key considerations for this particular response team is you are going to have to meet daily, particularly the kind of crisis and executive leaders of that response team meet daily. The situation is unfolding daily. So particularly for those organizations who are in Europe and North America who are just starting to experience the rising infection rates, your travel restrictions, your policies for employee work from home, and sick leave, your policies around what kinds of services you're going to deliver, whether you might actually have certain closures of offices, all of that is going to change daily based on the intelligence that you're getting about how the pandemic is actually unfolding. So throughout the hopefully just the few months that we're going to be dealing with this, your policies are going to be continuously changing, so you have to meet daily. And of course, I think this goes without saying, but just to reiterate, your response team is going to need the ability to meet virtually as well. We're going to talk later about enabling your virtual workforce and enabling employees to be effective while they're working remotely. The same applies to the response team. There's going to come a point where even yourselves, you either might have to self-quarantine or you've decided to close offices and everybody's working remotely. We've actually seen some large high-tech vendors already do that in North America. They've already mandated that the entire company is going to be working remotely for the next 30 days or so. So the response team itself has to have some pretty robust capabilities where you guys can meet and make these executive level decisions around policies as well as communicate them out to the business. The additional consideration around this crisis and response team is, remember, even your executives are going to be susceptible to COVID. And executives have friends and they have families, so if someone in their circle of those who are important to them gets sick, they're going to have to take care of them. We've actually already seen examples, actually. The head of the New York, New Jersey Port Authority was confirmed as having COVID. We've seen officials pretty high up in the British government. At one point, I saw a headline that said about 8% of public officials in Iran were infected. So everyone is susceptible. So every executive and key individual on your response team should have a backup. So you need a succession plan as part of this core group. So every executive and response team lead has a backup. They become a part of the daily response team meeting. So even if they're not part of the decision making today, they need to be a part of all of the meetings so that they can understand the logic and the discussion. And should someone get sick or should someone need to prioritize taking care of a sick family member, they have the ability to jump in. And they also have the full authority and respect of the response team to make the decisions. So have a succession plan, make those individuals a part of daily meetings as well.
So, Stephanie, would you say this is almost like having an understudy for a key role to make sure that they're always on and ready to jump in if the situation warrants it?
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect analogy. Perfect analogy. Great. So now we're on to step 2. And this is where we start to get into what will lead us into the ability to actually create a detailed plan.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Stephanie. So, during this crisis, or now I guess we're at official pandemic status, there's really no way to predict the impact that this is going to have on your business or the various business processes. And so the key here is to do something quickly versus to take longer to get additional information. What you want to do is a rapid business impact analysis to understand what might be the areas that are most impacted so that you know where to concentrate your communication, training, and response efforts. I can't stress enough how important it is that you don't get caught up in this analysis paralysis and you take the best information that you have at the moment to be able to, do this type of rapid BIA. And, as you're looking at it, you should consider, okay, these might be some of the short-term impacts that we have. So, how does it impact our business today, tomorrow, maybe this week? Consider the sort of middle term, so in the next few weeks, possibly a month. And although it seems like it's pretty far off, there are going to be some key areas where you can start looking at what some of the longer term implications might be. And as you're looking at that, it's really important to define where you're going to get your data or your information on the pandemic. I think we know that not all news has the same type of accuracy. And so, it's important to rely on sources of data from the World Health Organization and some other agencies that are, constantly putting out information. Really take a look at critical business dependencies, not just by function, but by location as well. So, for example, if you're a product-centric company, you might have facilities, factories, offices in certain areas, and you'll need to understand and map that out so you can start looking at the impact that might have on the business. Certainly, if you're more of a services-oriented company, you would want to understand where that business is coming from, what might be impacted, and start thinking of ways or alternate ways of providing that service. And then, of course, this extended supply chain, third-party relationship. So really that value chain. When everything is running properly, there are the partnerships that power your company. Now that, those relationships and these companies themselves are under stress, what might this mean to your organization? When we think of customer relationships, I think we should start exploring what might be some new or alternative ways of serving our customers. So, for example, can some in-person meetings be moved to online meetings? Can we change the nature of the deliverables to be able to accommodate what our company is capable of today. And then, of course, looking at the impact that that might have on employees and specific areas or business areas and roles and responsibilities of those employees themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the U.S., a lot of the major universities and other higher ed institutions have actually already canceled classes and have said that when students return from spring break, actually they don't want them to return. All classes will be virtual.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, yesterday I think I saw an email that Harvard University, because they've canceled classes for the rest of the semester, their professors are going to learn how to deliver those same lessons and case studies using, technology like WebEx and Zoom, and be able to turn it into a virtual classroom.
Yeah, and just to go a step further, I think you were going to talk about how you can, you can't predict the very long term. You can talk in the near term about the business and financial impact.
Yeah, I think that what's critical here is to look at these impacts in the context of the different areas. So, here, when we look at absenteeism or employees, certainly some business functions might need to look at alternate ways of working, but this is about putting in plans to make sure that the staff that you do have, or the amount of employees that you have, can still help you deliver your products and your services. Financial implications, some might be immediate. Certainly, if there's decreased demand for your product, or if you're unable to meet customer expectations, that's going to have a short-term financial impact. But there are also long-term implications of that as well. When you look at your supply chain, a lot of organizations have turned to this concept of just-in-time supply chain. So they're not holding a lot of inventory. They kind of look to churn inventory as they need it. This is a really great opportunity when you're looking at the business impact to reach out to your supply chain and ask if perhaps they have additional capacity. Maybe this is a time, if they're able to meet greater orders, to be able to leverage them to, get that type of buffer stock that you need to continue to operate. And, lastly, there's this financial viability insolvency, especially for smaller companies. And, what we know about third-party and supply chain relationships is that a majority of them are smaller companies, typically privately held companies. And so if that type of continuity is really important, you might want to consider extending payment terms or working with your suppliers to be able to help them through this, financially difficult time, so that you can, not only can you get your or what you need from them, but help the organization stay afloat until we hopefully weather this storm in short order.
Yeah. And for these two steps, 2A and 2B, around, doing the BIA in advance of documenting your plan, there's a lot of key considerations and best practices here, which we're going to cover. The first one I'll take the lead on, and Alla alluded to this, which is, step one about identifying your critical sources of information for intelligence. There is so much disinformation out there right now about the pandemic. A lot of it's coming from social media, and it's spread through social media. And it's interesting, Forrester's running this large-scale survey right now. And we're asking employees about their perceptions and how they're feeling, and how they feel that their organizations are preparing for the pandemic. And one of the questions we ask them is, where do they go for reliable sources of information? And what we do found is that majority of them are on social media. Only about half of employees trust anything on there. We did actually find that employees do trust their employers and they do trust major news organizations and government organizations. But at the same time, because they are on social media, you've got to be careful about the kind of disinformation they might even subconsciously be integrating into some of their thinking. So make sure that you're relying on good sources of information, and then that way when you're crafting your communication strategies, you're providing employees with reliable information. You can also point them to reliable information. So obviously the WHO in the US, Centers for Disease Control, European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, and there's obviously country-specific disease control within Europe and also other geographies. I'm highlighting John Hopkins here because they actually offer this dashboard, which I've got a screenshot on, and it allows you to get down to the city level to determine the number of infections there are within a given geography. It gets incredibly detailed and it's global. So as you're thinking about travel restrictions and travel bans beyond entire countries or regions, this could potentially let you get down to even restrictions on specific cities, as an example. That's how detailed it is. The other thing I like about them is they have a daily situation report and newsletter that's global and it's incredibly detailed. And it's taking advantage of global information sources. So I've personally, as I've been helping Forrester clients and in our pandemic research, have found it really invaluable. So that's just one example of something that I personally have been using.
So the key consideration number 4 is when we look beyond the initial business impact assessment, while that was a great way to set a baseline, a quick and dirty understanding of where you are right now, use this opportunity as more information becomes available to start doing a BIA on specific areas. So for example, and I think I alluded to this a little earlier, is that if you have products and services, look at the information that's coming out through those trusted sources, but also that are coming from your partners, your third parties, your supply chain to identify what are the most critical products to your business and also what might the impact of possible disruption be. The same is true with key processes. So maybe this is workflow for things like placing an order or invoicing or shipping. There will be impacts to some of the steps along this workflow. By understanding what those bottlenecks can be, you're much better able to set expectations with your customers. And then finally, there's that systems. We all our businesses rely on key systems, and when they're functioning at 100%, everything works well. But understanding that we might be working from home, not all systems might be available to us. Look at the stress of those systems and how they play a role in being able to serve customers in the products and the services that you produce. So make this an iterative process and use updated information to reassess this on an ongoing basis. And I think we can turn to the next slide.
Great.
So, here we spoke about it a little earlier, but for a lot of organizations, they're dusting off business continuity plans. And actually, for about 25% of organizations, this might be their very first time creating a business continuity plan. So don't assume that your third parties have a plan in place. There are some industries that are where business continuity is a requirement and they may already have something, But for those that don't, work with them. If you have lessons learned or you want to support them in the process, use this as an opportunity to help them out because ultimately you're benefiting your own business as well. Here we see how an effect of a supplier in a specific industry can really start have rippling effects within that sector altogether. I think that playing a part in making sure our own organizations can, move past this pandemic and minimize impact, improve resilience is great, but also take this opportunity to build those relationships with with your key business partners and help make that relationship stronger because that will help you maintain resilience now while you're impacted, but also it'll go a long way after this is over.
Yeah, I would also just reiterate here, most organizations have moved some of their core business applications and even infrastructure to the cloud. Don't make assumptions about the cloud providers. One of the things that we actually saw in China, actually Forrester has an office in Beijing. We have a number of Beijing-based analysts. As almost a large portion of the country started working remotely and working from home, even the largest tech providers in the country like Alibaba and Tencent had trouble with the spikes in demand for their collaboration technologies. So don't assume even the cloud providers will be able to handle the demand that's going to suddenly happen for their services when everybody starts working from home. The other thing I would say too is, some of your software as a service providers are small. There are smaller providers who have actually built their service on top of the big cloud giants. So again, and a lot of their availability and their scalability depends on how they've architected their service on top of those cloud giants. So I would just make a plea that don't assume that your cloud providers can handle huge spikes in demands. You've got to talk to them, understand how they're ramping, and it's something to just be conscious of that, particularly in the beginning, across like Europe and North America, when we see people suddenly in large percentages work from home, that's definitely going to be an issue.
That's a great point.
The other consideration is about your employees. I would say right now, as I've been talking to a lot of clients and I've been analyzing our pandemic employee experience survey data, most companies, the core of their workforce continuity strategy is remote work. And that is important, and I definitely recommend it. A couple of things with remote work. If you don't have a culture where you've been supporting employees working from remotely, expect some hiccups when people suddenly start working remotely. What's clear and expected of them. If people aren't used to being available on chat, on IM, responding quickly to email. I actually even today's like voice and video teleconferencing technologies, it can be really hard to get some of it working seamlessly across locations and different rooms and facilities. It can be complicated. So the technology can be complicated at first. Culturally, it can be a big mind shift for people. There's even some people have talked about like it can feel isolating and disconnecting working from home. So there's a lot of things to iron out in the beginning when people start working from home. The second thing is like not all of your employees can work from home, depending on your industry. I mean, you think about frontline workers in retail and hospitality, any kind of worker that what I'm calling works in a facility, somebody in manufacturing, in warehouse and fulfillment centers, transportation, you name it. There's a lot of employees potentially within your enterprise that aren't going to be able to work from home. Even if you're a high-tech company and you think all of your employees can work from home, even your facilities still need some employees to do maintenance and physical security. Really think through all of your employee roles. And that means your employee strategy, your workforce continuity strategy has to be more robust than just work from home. Use that as a basis and then build on it. But think about like where potentially you might have to recruit contract workers to help fill in, for example, with frontline workers. Even at a point too, like even your employees that are working remotely doesn't mean that they still can't get sick from community spread. It doesn't mean that somebody in their household can't get sick and then they have to take care of them. So different rates of absenteeism, needing to bolster frontline workers. There's a number of reasons why you might actually need some contract workers. Another option would be to cross-train employees in multiple roles and responsibilities. I mentioned this earlier, for all of your key executives, and I would even say like VPs, managers, and directors have succession planning in place. So as those individuals get sick, there's somebody to take their place and make those decisions. Again, depending on your industry, you might be able to consider something like a workload rotation where you have the ability to rotate certain functions and customer service to other regions that are less impacted. Financial services firms have always been really good at the ability to do this. And then, unfortunately, in some situations, like we saw in China, there is going to come a point potentially where you do actually have to close facilities or you have to reduce your level of services until the worst of the pandemic is over, and then you can resume services. We've already seen, for example, across Europe and the US, airlines drastically reducing their flight options, putting a freeze on hiring. So those tough decisions that you make in the short term might ensure your long-term financial viability and your ability to get back to full capacity in the future, and hopefully bring staff back on. So that brings us to step number 3, which is where we really start to build the plan specifics. I wanted to lead off with communication because I've been in business continuity for about 20 years, and we also run annual surveys with the Disaster Recovery Journal. We ask people, after you've invoked your plan, what was the biggest lesson learned? And the top 2 had always consistently, year after year, is that there hadn't been enough training and awareness, and that the plan drastically underestimated how difficult it was to communicate under duress during the stress of the situation. So I want to lead off with communication, and we actually have a kind of key consideration coming up. So I'll kind of wait to go into detail, but communication across audiences with specific messages over time across multiple channels is going to be really important. The preventative measures that you're going to put in place, it's almost impossible to stop the spread of the disease with like travel bans and travel restrictions. What those do is actually help you slow the spread. And part of it is as a fiduciary responsibility to the public is to help slow that spread so that you're not overwhelming local healthcare facilities and the overall healthcare system. So preventative measures, travel restrictions, social distancing, facility cleaning, putting out hand sanitizers, all of the basics that you're doing to help prevent as well as slow the spread of the disease itself. The next thing is Ala mentioned, and we've talked a lot about, is all of your specific contingency plans for either the products or service that you deliver, as well as your individual business functions and processes. Supply chain, thinking about supply chain disruptions, what kind of workarounds you have, that level of detail. We talked a lot about, most of your pandemic plan being around people. So this is, again, like why HR plays such a huge role. They kind of can help with the communication strategy, help with the preventative measures, but they really kind of lead on the changes to employee sick leave and work from home policies. Those are really, really important. I mentioned all of the strategies around workforce, from remote work, but also employee cross-training, succession planning, and outsourcing. We've downplayed technology a little bit, but there is a big role for technology. It does play a huge role in enabling the remote work. Everything from telecommunication collaboration, access to critical applications, access to critical data. Those are just some of the few things. Then we also need technology to actually support the communication. If you're a large enterprise and you're talking about having to communicate with tens of thousands of employees globally in multiple languages, you're not going to rely on simple like emails and call tree lists for that to happen. Whether it's a major change in policy or an update, you're going to want to be able to send that kind of message at scale with confirmation to the entire organization. And there's technologies that really help you do that. Um, I mentioned training and awareness, so this is going one step beyond communication. And I put this last one here, medical guidance, and I put an asterisk next to it because what I don't want to say is that in any way that you're going to be responsible for providing people with medical um, counseling or specific diagnostic and information, but more about like teaching employees where to go for good information, and some best practices for taking care of themselves. And if at some point down the road we actually have a vaccine, in the past I have seen organizations offer the vaccine on site. So that's down the road. There's no vaccine on site, but if there were, that could be something that could be delivered by the organization. Other than that, it's just providing helpful information about where employees can go for additional information. So a little bit about the communication. I mentioned it's always one of the top lessons learned from prior invocations. And again, it's because I think companies don't necessarily think through communication holistically. Think about your different audiences, what you're going to say to employees, customers, your partners and suppliers, and then the kind of messaging that you might put out so that the general public is aware of what you're doing. And even within employees, like there's potentially messages that you're going to craft for different employee audiences, from frontline workers to managers, in different regions as well. And one thing I should say, when I refer to customers, depending on your organization, whoever your ultimate end customer is, that could be a consumer, that could be a patient, it could be a citizen. That's who I'm referring to, your ultimate end customer. It could be another company. You're a B2B organization. You want to reach these audiences through multiple channels, and preferably actually be able to reach them through the method that they actually do prefer. It is the internal plan and policy specifics. Messages that actually might go to both employees and customers, such as preventative measures. We've actually seen this in retail as an example. So some of the same kind of both digital and physical signage that you might offer to employees around social distancing, coughing into your sleeve, frequent hand washing, use of hand sanitizers, messages about how frequently the facility is being cleaned and your overall readiness. There's actually messages that would actually go to all of those audiences. And then even, for customers, there could be specific messages that would be just for them. For example, the changes to their service levels or any kind of availability of your products and services to them. Changes in customer-facing policies. Example, if you're in financial services, maybe there's going to be changes to fees. Interestingly enough, I'll use retail again. Right now, in both like Europe and the United States and North America in general, there's been a lot of discussion about, as people do realize how serious this is and they start to prepare, there's been a run on certain items, everything from, again, the hand sanitizers to toilet paper to stocking up on food. Some organizations have actually had to put in policies limiting what their, how much customers can actually purchase at once. Stop that run on.
Yeah, that's really helpful information on messaging. And when we looked earlier about who should be in that critical response team, and we looked at the role of the CMO, one of the reasons for that is because they own the messaging. And when you think about your messaging strategy around COVID, and yes, you absolutely need a messaging strategy, you should really think about how can you communicate in a way that's clear, concise, informative, but at the same time actionable, whether that talks about actions that you're taking or actions that you want the reader to take. Very important to not overthink the message. It's much more critical that you get the message out in a timely way versus, definitely prioritize speed over eloquence. Assume that you'll probably be sending out multiple messages So don't try to overstuff one message with too much information, but rather focus on what you know at this point and what might be coming down or what you want the reader to, do either for you or understand about the level of service you're able to provide. And so, this is, I think, a good example of an email that was sent probably 3 or 4 days ago. And Delta took a really good approach because, the email is personalized, right? It's signed by their CEO. And it talks about how, the traveler is important and what they're doing, what steps they're taking to protect the traveler. I think it's also okay that you may not have all the answers in your original email. Don't let not having all those answers keep you from sending out the emails. Because I think, customers, employees, partners certainly appreciate the speed in which you're communicating to them. So definitely prioritize that over getting it out versus getting it perfect.
Yeah, and just to go on with key considerations, I mentioned training and awareness being critical because this was actually the number one thing that people said was the biggest lesson learned from prior business continuity invocations. So it goes beyond the communication, the initial communication, the ongoing communication. Training and awareness goes a step beyond that. So some of it could be the digital and physical signage that I talked about, but beyond that, it's taking more measures to help teach employees and customers about things like social distancing and prevention. What we've seen actually in a lot of organizations, both government and private sector in Asia, who've been dealing with this for months, is they often took the time to create kind of catchy videos set to music that was both for employees and customers, like teaching them the basics of social distancing and good prevention techniques. And the medium made it entertaining. People shared it. It was really effective. The other thing we often find in our lessons learned is that employees hadn't been involved in regular testing, and we're going to be talking about testing the plan in a second. So, involving as many employees as possible in regular testing. Testing is, I think, the best way to actually not only teach employees about their roles and responsibilities, but to make them feel comfortable in their roles and responsibilities. Because it's interesting, people under stressful situations will react differently than the way they typically behave in the office on a daily basis. Sometimes people who are loud and vocal get very quiet, and then sometimes people who are quiet turn out to be the opposite in stressful situations. People revert back to native languages when they get stressed. So testing helps familiarize people and also kind of take the stress out of situations that they've never been in before. Yeah, and this is just an example of some of the good signage that we've seen around preventative measures and just overall education and giving people good information. So there's a lot of good examples that we wanted to just sort of put out there for people to see.
And I think, in terms of awareness and communications, they don't need to be limited to just emails. They can definitely be more engaging than a set of slides or, a training video. But I think that, this is a really great opportunity to create training and awareness content that, if you pardon my pun, goes viral. And, think about sharing that content. I think we've even seen short videos or apps that will turn your favorite song into instruction manual about how long you need to wash your hands. So it's not that companies are trying to make light of it, but not every communication needs to be so dire. I think we can make it a little bit more hopeful, but certainly instructional and educational.
And so that brings us to key consideration number 9, which is about travel restrictions, because this has also been sort of the mainstay of a lot of the initial preventative measures that companies are implementing. And you'll have to continuously update them as well. What I would recommend is don't be vague. Don't say things like use your judgment. This happened a lot actually during SARS. Companies didn't put out specific travel restrictions. They just said use your judgment. And that's actually really difficult on employees. They like specifics. So I would be very specific about your travel restrictions to and from locations. Be ready to update those travel restrictions frequently on new intelligence from major health organizations. If an employee has traveled to an infected area, whether it's for work or personally, be clear about the amount of time that they need to spend in self-quarantine before they can come back to a physical office. I would say at this point, consider limiting all non-essential travel as of now. In fact, in North America, I've already seen some very large organizations already move to complete remote work. That may or may not be too early for a lot of you on the call, but it's something to definitely consider. But I do think in the meantime, in addition to key travel restrictions, making sure that people self-quarantine after high-risk areas, whether that's for personal or work travel, consider limiting all non-essential travelers. Another key thing is it's not just about where your employees go. Anybody coming to one of your physical locations or your events, they have to be assessed, be they customers or partners. Have processes and procedures in your physical security for assessing travelers coming in and out. I think it's also time to assess your own events as well, potentially like converting a lot of your events to virtual if they're of large scale. I think, at least as of a couple days ago, the World Health Organization was recommending, any event over 1,000 people to go virtual. I've already seen some cities in North America take more aggressive steps. And then, of course, in places like Italy, where the entire country's on lockdown, they've canceled any kind of large scale events. Just to keep going, so we have more time, my slides. Step 4, test your plan. We've talked a lot about so much of your plan actually being around policies and good procedures, sending people home to work, having workarounds for supply chain disruptions, things of that nature. You could still test your plan. So for example, the response team, you can have frequent plan walkthroughs, and you can use some of those scenarios that we've listed. What happens when there's 5, 10, 15% absenteeism? What happens when there's more severe government restrictions on travel? So you can start to talk about those potential scenarios and then adjust your plan accordingly, challenge the assumptions in your plan. The other thing I would recommend too is right now, do a real simulation of work from home. The U.S. federal government is planning to send a lot of employees home to simulate this. Actually, JP Morgan, and I've seen other financial services firms, they're actually telling a large percentage of their workforce to go home and to go work from home remotely now. And it's a means to kind of test their ability to handle that many employees working remotely. Again, most large enterprises are going to be a mix of applications and systems that are on-prem as well as in the cloud. So you're testing your ability for your on-premise systems and applications as well as things like your VPN. Even if you are mostly on cloud services, how can you handle the load on all of your systems? Security considerations for people working from home. What kind of device security do you have in place, and what kind of end user security do you have in place? So test those things now if you haven't. It's interesting, things unfolded so quickly in Italy. The Italian government actually just had to mandate as many employees as possible to work from home, and they never had an opportunity to test any of it. So you don't want to be facing that situation where it comes to the point where you're ordering people to work from home and you haven't tested it yet. Yeah, and so when it comes to the testing, again, you want to experiment with sending a large percentage of your workforce home. You want to test their full range of job responsibilities and functions to make sure that they can truly do their role from home. You might also want to consider making sure that you have a slice of different job functions all working remotely. Because you want to be able to test not only the load on your systems, but again, could a combination of different job functions who make up a full end-to-end business process or delivery of a product or service actually be able to deliver that from home if they're working remotely. There's a lot of things to consider about employees suddenly working from home en masse. And those are all the kinds of things that you can consider now and take home. I went a little faster. Did you have anything to add before I to the last slide?
No, actually, I was just going to take on that last slide and hopefully have time for one or two questions. So, don't underestimate how your company's decisions on risk management, business continuity impact your reputation. I think all the key stakeholders, your customers, employees, partners, they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for integrity, and how your company handles itself through communication, through acts, through how you weather the storm is going to say a lot. It's going to define who you are. And, organizations that are understanding that risk management is iterative and aren't, are being more proactive about it, or actually getting a lot more positive results. So, with that, I think that concludes our webinar, and I think we could probably move on to a couple of questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Ala, and thank you, Stephanie. So we're going to start the Q&A session now. If you have a question or comment for either of our presenters today, just leave it on the chat. Use the drop-down, select all panelists before sending to ensure that both Stephanie and Ala can see your question. And while we're doing that, we do ask that you please take a moment to complete our short feedback poll. So I've just deployed that, and for the sake of making it easier for you guys, so we had a couple questions come in. I'll go ahead and read one of them here for you guys. It is, do you have a template for communication to cover basically the various aspects of the disease? So does Forrester have anything like that, guys? Do you know?
I do have sample kind of business continuity plans that have example communication templates in them. So I don't think I've posted it to Forrester.com, but if we have this individual's specific email address, I can send something after the fact.
All right, perfect. We can make sure to set them up with that. Another question here, would government provide guidelines on employee sick leave, et cetera? And they specify here by saying it would be difficult for some companies to make those types of decisions, and it would help if government or regulatory authorities would provide guidelines.
Yeah, I agree. It would definitely be helpful. And I think this varies by country. Within Europe, and certainly like when you're looking at U.S. versus Europe, but the attendee's correct. I mean, in some instances, for example, like here in the U.S., if a certain amount of vacation time can't be carried over past March, I don't think an employer has the ability to actually change that rule, because it's set by some states like California, and then there's certain states that other states and federal law that actually mandates that. But there are situations like actually Google, who just announced that all North American employees are going to be working from home. It actually impacts a lot of contract workers who work in their facilities that actually aren't covered by sick leave or paid leave. And actually Google's creating a fund for them so that they don't feel stressed about needing to take time off. So there are situations for certain types of employees where I think employers can definitely take the lead and either go beyond any kind of government mandates that may or may not be there.
Okay, and we do have another one that came in. I know that we're at the hour, so let me know if you guys are okay with continuing. Otherwise, we can hold off and we can answer online. So just let me know.
Yeah, let's maybe take one or two more. Just go
Okay.
over slightly, and then we'll catch up everybody up by email whose question we didn't get to.
Sure. So the latest question we got here is, are you aware of any vendors cutting slack on licenses for rapid scale up, thinking of things like multi-factor authentication, VPN, and such?
It's interesting. The security ones like MFA and VPN, I have not, but the the vendors have on all of the collaboration tools and all of the tools that you need for remote work. They've been very generous. In fact, some of the largest providers have actually been offering to give those services for free to companies that don't currently have them. So no, I haven't seen anything on the security side just yet, but the general collaboration, remote technologies, the vendors have actually been very generous, and I think they'd be willing to work with you.
Okay. Let's see here. Any other closing comments, guys?
That's it for now. I mean, I think actually I'll just maybe the very last slide I'll put up is our contact information. So if there was anyone who thinks of a question later, we are definitely available for inquiries or just general emails that hopefully we can answer for you, and hopefully this was valuable.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Ala, and thank you to our participants for their participation today. I should note that we do have another webinar scheduled for the 16th of March. It follows up on this very same topic, the title being the Pandemic Employee Experience Journey. So a little bit more focused on EX practices. I'll go ahead and put the link on the chat. If you're interested in registering, just make sure you're logged into your Forrester account. And with that being said, thank you again to everybody. This concludes today's webinar.